Hello, I'm Joanne Sefton and this is the Mitchell Law Tea Break. I'm here with Catherine Mitchell, and as regular viewers will know, we get together every few weeks to chat about something in employment law. This time we're talking about a subject rather close to my heart, which is adoption. Nearly 5 years ago, I adopted two fabulous children along with my husband. We were both employees at the time, still are, and I have to say, even as an employment lawyer, I didn't find it easy to navigate the adoption process and to understand what our rights and obligations were as employees in each part of that process. If you are an HR professional, you might be quite used to dealing with maternity cases. They can be complicated enough sometimes. But adoption is something that probably will only come up once in a while. So I hope you find the video useful, but we also hope that it might be useful for adoptive parents or prospective adoptive parents trying to begin to understand their own rights.
I'm really pleased that we're able to do this video with your personal perspective. So let's start at the start. And the way the law deals with adoption is based on the way it deals with maternity. So what should we know about the actual adoption process before looking at how those rights work in practice?
Okay, well, I suppose a good starting point is the fact that when a couple have a baby, it's normally pretty obvious which one of them is going to actually be having it.
Yeah, and I hate that thing where men say, we're pregnant, you're also not pregnant.
Exactly. So a single adopter is, male or female, essentially treated like the mother in a maternity case. So that's your starting point. When you adopt as a couple, including as a single-sex couple, you have to pick one person to be the main adopter and one person to be, if you like, the sidekick. Those aren't actually the terms that the law uses, but they get the point across. So the rights of the main adopter will mirror the maternity rights of the mother, whereas the rights of the secondary adopter mirror paternity rights. And of course, as we know, those are significantly more restricted.
Okay, and what about foster to adopt? Because that's probably worth talking about at this stage.
So foster to adopt, if you're not familiar with that, is where a would-be adopter gets approved by an adoption agency to be both a foster carer and an adopter, where a child has to be removed from their birth parents either at birth or at a very young age. They would previously have been placed in foster care, and then once assessments had been done and if adoption was the right plan for them, they would have been moved on to an adoptive placement. So the idea with foster to adopt is that if it seems likely that adoption is going to be the ultimate outcome, the baby can go to one placement as a foster child and then not have the upheaval and trauma of being moved on to an adoptive family later on.
Okay, so I can see it's much harder to mirror maternity rights when you're using that model. But do you get leave when the child is placed or when it's adopted or both, or what if the adoption never actually happens?
Well, exactly, and that's not the only area where the idea of mirroring maternity rights breaks down. The whole thing is predicated on the formal date of the child's placement being equivalent to the date of birth in a birth case. But modern adoption works on a model of introductions where the children and the parents gradually build up contact with each other over a period of weeks. So it can be quite hard to square that with the model of maternity leave that we're used to. And we'll talk about that a bit more later.
Okay, so let's jump back to earlier in the process for pregnant women who are allowed time off for antenatal appointments. Have we also got adopters being allowed time off for their adoption appointments, I should say? That's
right, but that right is limited to meetings that take place after an adoption agency has notified you that they expect to place a particular child with you. Before you get to that point, you're likely to have a number of meetings and training events to assess your suitability as a potential adopter. Perhaps other events like family finding events where you might get to meet children who are available for adoption, and none of that would be covered by the formal right to leave.
So if those fall within working hours, you would need to take annual leave or unpaid leave if your employer agrees?
Essentially, yes. Many people might want to be quite discreet about a decision to adopt until it's more final, so often annual leave might be the first choice in those situations. I think for employers it's worth being aware that if you want to support someone regardless of the legal obligations, there will be quite a time commitment from your employee even at this early stage. So from the point of view of the employee, it's worth asking your adoption agency to map out what the commitment's likely to be. So some agencies will hold training in the evenings, for example, so that might be helpful if you work office hours, and thinking about how you might manage those commitments alongside your work.
So once you're notified that the agency expects to place a particular child with you, the rights to time off mirror those for antenatal appointments.
Yes. Now, if you're going to take advantage of that route and you're adopting as a couple, then really this is when you have to pick who is going to take that main adopter role. Because one of you is entitled to up to 6 appointments with pay, and the other is entitled to only 2 appointments with no right to pay.
Right.
And if you get paid time off, you cannot later take paternity leave. So to take full advantage of the way those rights fit together as a couple, you have to decide at that stage who is going to take the maternity rights and who is going to take the paternity rights. Just to stick in my personal tuppence worth here, I can absolutely see that it would seem unfair if both partners in an adoptive couple got to take full maternity leave. But I don't think it really works to compare the antenatal medical appointments to pre-adoption appointments. There's much more of a requirement for both adoptive parents to participate. And much more of the preparation for adoption involves meetings and appointments than a normal pregnancy would do.
And of course, in the unfortunate situation that there were medical issues with the pregnancy, the woman would have rights to take sick leave and a right not to be penalised for doing so.
Yeah, and that's one area where the read across from maternity doesn't work. We're going to move on now and talk about placements. So where an adopter or a couple are matched for adoption with a particular child or children, they will get a matching certificate, and that will include details of the expected date when the adoption placement will start. One adopter will be entitled to take maternity leave, adoption leave, essentially the same as maternity leave. They notify the employer of the date they want that adoption leave to start, and that can't be more than 14 days before the scheduled placement date.
So we know from our HR contacts that the speed with which adoption matches can happen is one of the big issues, and there isn't actually too much you can do about that. It's in the nature of what we're dealing with. I suppose all we can recommend is openness and communication, and encouraging those in hopes that you might get a bit more notice that a placement is in the offing, even if the confirmation is likely to be late in the day.
Yeah. Another issue from the point of view of the employee, and to an extent the employer, is that the placement might not neatly begin on one day. In our case, which is probably quite a good example, the local authority who were placing the children felt that they would benefit from gradually getting to know us. So they planned out an introduction programme which started with a first meeting about 5 weeks before the placement date, and built up gradually until the children were spending full days with us in the week before the placement. They'd visited the house, and they're just going back to sleep at the foster carer's house. It was all in a different part of the country, so even in the first couple of weeks of that programme, it wasn't practical for my husband and myself to be in work at the times that we weren't actually with the kids. I'm not actually sure it would have been any good at work anyway. It's a real emotional roller coaster when you meet your new children, play with them for 2 hours, then come into the office and do your day job. That would be quite a big ask.
So how did it all work out?
Well, in our case, my husband was the one taking adoption leave, so he was able to be off for the final 2 weeks, and he was able to take some annual leave to cover the days we needed before that. I was lucky in that I was able to take some additional leave. I think the reality is that most employers will be quite understanding in the circumstances, but even then, it can be a really difficult thing to talk about, especially I've had people I've known in this situation. If you feel very emotional about the whole thing and you find yourself in a situation where you have to explain it perhaps to one manager and to another manager and to someone in HR, it can be really difficult. So I think it's an area where sort of objectivity and people skills that really good HR professionals have can be really valuable.
Well, this has been our longest tea break, and there is so much more we could say. I hope it's been helpful in outlining the landscape around adoption in the workplace, and please do contact us if you'd like specific advice. But for now, it's time to say goodbye and see you for another tea break soon.